I was 13 years old when I first tried heroin, and in that moment, I thought I had found paradise. The drug didn't just numb the physical pain from my father's anger, it erased the screaming voices in my head that told me I was worthless, unwanted, a mistake that should have never been born. By 15, I was living on the streets of Detroit, doing whatever it took to afford my next hit. I watched my reflection disappear day by day in broken mirrors and dirty windows, until I couldn't recognize the hollow person staring back at me. My mother had given up searching for me after I stole her wedding ring, the only thing of value she had left after my father abandoned us. The close calls with death became as regular as breathing. 3 times the paramedics brought me back from the edge, and each time I cursed them for it. I had lost all hope. I prayed to a God I wasn't sure existed, to just let me slip away into the peace where the pain couldn't follow me anymore. But what I'm about to tell you isn't just another story about addiction. It's about the miracle that happened when I was lying in that crack house in Memphis, barely conscious and completely defeated. Because today, as I stand here in a village in Uganda, watching children who have nothing smile brighter than I ever thought possible, I know that sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers the way we expect. Sometimes He has bigger plans for our broken pieces than we could ever imagine. My name is Marcus Thompson, and if you had told me 20 years ago that I would be telling this story as a missionary in Africa instead of another statistic, I would have laughed until I cried, or maybe just cried, because that's all I seemed capable of back then. This testimony isn't easy for me to share. There are parts of my story that still wake me up at night, sweating and shaking, remembering the person I used to be. But I've learned that our greatest pain often becomes our greatest purpose. And if my story can reach even one person who feels as hopeless as I once did, then every word is worth it. I want you to understand something from the beginning. This isn't a fairy tale. Recovery isn't a straight line, and faith doesn't magically erase the consequences of our choices. But what I discovered in a Christian recovery house in rural Tennessee changed everything about how I saw myself, my purpose, and the God who never stopped pursuing me, even when I was running as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Before we dive deeper into this journey together, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you believe in the power of redemption. Your support helps me share these stories of hope with people around the world who desperately need to hear them. And please, leave a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from all around the world and hearing where these stories are reaching people. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, in a house that should have been filled with love, but instead echoed with violence and fear. My childhood home in Flint, Michigan, was a war zone disguised as a 2-bedroom ranch house with peeling paint and broken dreams. My father, Robert Thompson, worked the assembly line at the GM plant until the layoffs came in '92, and after that, his anger became his primary form of communication. My mother, Sarah, tried to shield my younger sister Emma and me from his rage, but when you're living in a hurricane, there's nowhere to hide. I remember being 8 years old, pressing my ear against my bedroom door, listening to my mother's muffled sobs after another discussion with my father. The sound of breaking glass became as familiar as a lullaby, and I learned to sleep through screaming matches that would make the neighbors call the police, though they never stayed long enough to actually help. School became my escape, but even there, I carried the weight of shame like a backpack full of stones. Teachers would ask about the bruises on my arms, and I became an expert liar before I hit double digits. I fell off my bike. I bumped into a door. I'm just clumsy. The excuses rolled off my tongue as easily as the Pledge of Allegiance. When I turned 11, my father left us for good, but the damage was already embedded in my DNA. He didn't just abandon our family. He left behind a legacy of worthlessness that I wore like a second skin. My mother, broken and desperate, started bringing home men who saw a young boy and a little girl as obstacles to their temporary happiness. My mother looked at me with eyes that had already died inside when I tried to tell her about the things happening in our house. "We need the money, Marcus. Just stay in your room," she said. That night, I learned that even the people who are supposed to protect you will sacrifice you to survive. I started acting out at school, getting into fights, failing classes, screaming at teachers who tried to help. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, pulled me aside one day and said, "Marcus, I see so much potential in you, but you're destroying yourself from the inside out." I looked at her with all the hatred I could muster and said, "Maybe I deserve to be destroyed." The summer I turned 13, I met Kevin Rodriguez behind the Quick Mart on Dort Highway. Kevin was 16, drove a stolen Honda Civic, and had the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting your next meal or wondering if someone was going to hurt you while you slept. He offered me my first joint, and for the first time in my life, the noise in my head went quiet. Within weeks, marijuana became my religion, and Kevin became my prophet. He taught me how to steal car stereos, how to spot undercover cops, and how to lie to my mother so convincingly that she actually believed I was doing better. The drugs didn't solve my problems, they just made me care less about having them. But marijuana was just the opening act. Kevin introduced me to his older brother, Miguel, who dealt harder stuff, pills at first, then cocaine, and finally, the drug that would become both my salvation and my destruction, heroin. Miguel looked at my skinny frame and desperate eyes and saw dollar signs. "Kid like you," he said, "customers will trust you. You don't look like a dealer." The first time I used heroin, I was 13 years old and alone in an abandoned house on the east side of Flint. Kevin had shown me how to prepare it, how to be careful, how to avoid going too far. The moment that poison entered my bloodstream, I understood why people threw their lives away for this feeling. It wasn't just the physical euphoria, though, that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was the emotional numbness that saved me. For the first time since my father's first punch, since the chaos began in my house, since my mother chose survival over my safety, I felt nothing, and nothing was better than the constant pain that had become my normal. That night, as I lay on a dirty mattress in a house that smelled like despair, watching the sunset through a broken window, I made a promise to myself I would never feel that kind of pain again. I would do whatever it took to maintain this beautiful numbness, no matter the cost. I had no idea that I had just signed my own death warrant with a needle and a spoon. Within 6 months of that first hit, heroin had become my master, and I was its willing slave. What started as weekend experimentation quickly escalated to daily use, then hourly cravings that consumed every thought, every breath, every decision I made. I stopped going to school altogether, and my mother was too lost in her own addictions, prescription pills and cheap wine, to notice or care. My transformation was rapid and horrifying. I went from a 140-pound 8th grader to a frail ghost who weighed barely 110 pounds. My teeth began to decay, my hair fell out in clumps, and needle marks covered my arms like scars of my choices. When I looked in the mirror, I saw my father staring back at me, the same hollow eyes, the same defeated posture, the same capacity for destroying everything good in his life. To maintain my habit, I became everything I had once despised. I stole from churches, from elderly neighbors who trusted me, from children's birthday money hidden in bedroom drawers. I broke into houses during funerals, knowing the families would be at the cemetery while I ransacked their homes for anything valuable enough to trade for drugs. The worst part wasn't the stealing, it was how easy it became. The first time I took $20 from my little sister's piggy bank, I cried for hours. The 10th time, I felt nothing. The 20th time, I was angry that she didn't have more. Heroin didn't just change my body, it rewired my soul, turning empathy into apathy, love into manipulation, hope into desperation. When I turned 15, my mother finally kicked me out, not because she was angry, but because she was afraid. "I can't watch you destroy yourself in my house," she said, tears streaming down her face as she handed me a garbage bag with my few remaining possessions. "Maybe the streets will teach you what I couldn't." She was wrong. The streets didn't teach me anything, except how to survive one more day. Living homeless in Detroit was like being trapped in a nightmare that reset every morning. I slept in abandoned buildings, under bridges, in 24-hour laundromats when it was too cold to survive outside. I learned which dumpsters behind which restaurants had the best discarded food, which shelters were safe for a few hours of sleep, and which corners were controlled by which dealers. To pay for drugs, I did things that still make me sick to remember. I participated in robberies that left innocent people traumatized and afraid. I watched friends collapse from bad drugs and sometimes die while I searched their pockets for leftover substances instead of calling for help. The guilt was unbearable, but not as unbearable as withdrawal. The near-death experiences became as routine as meals, except I rarely ate meals anymore. The first time I nearly died, in an alley behind a Pizza Hut, the paramedics who revived me seemed genuinely concerned about my welfare. By the 4th time, They looked at me like a waste of resources, another junkie taking up space that could be used for someone who actually wanted to live. But here's the thing about addiction that people don't understand. I didn't want to die, but I couldn't figure out how to live. Every morning I woke up promising myself I would get clean, and every evening I fell asleep with a needle in my arm, hating myself for my weakness but unable to break the cycle that had become stronger than my will to survive. The lowest point came when I was 17, living in a crack house in Memphis after hitchhiking south to escape a drug debt in Detroit. I hadn't spoken to my family in 2 years, hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks, and hadn't looked at myself in a mirror because I couldn't bear to see what I had become. The other addicts in the house called me Ghost because I was so thin and pale that I looked like I was already dead. That's when I met Tommy Hernandez, a 25-year-old veteran who had lost his legs in Iraq and found heroin as his painkiller of choice. Tommy and I became running partners, stealing together, using together, nearly dying together. He was the closest thing I had to family, which made what happened next even more devastating. On a cold February morning in 2008, I found Tommy in his sleeping bag, blue and lifeless, with a needle still in his arm. He had taken too much sometime during the night while I slept 3 feet away from him, too high to notice my friend dying beside me. As I stared at his body, I realized I wasn't sad, I was jealous. Tommy had found the ultimate escape, and I was still trapped in this hell, too afraid to live and too cowardly to die. That night, I decided to join him. I had made a desperate plan to end my life, something I'm deeply grateful I survived and can now share as part of my testimony of hope. I had prepared what I thought would be my way out, and I chose what seemed like the perfect place, an abandoned church on the south side of Memphis. The irony wasn't lost on me, choosing to end my story in a house of worship that had been gutted by fire and forgotten by its congregation. The stained glass windows were shattered, graffiti covered the walls where hymns once echoed, and drug needles littered the altar where people once came to find God. It seemed fitting that my life would end in a place that had also been abandoned. As I prepared to go through with my plan, my hands were steadier than they had been in years. This wasn't desperation, this was what felt like resolution. I thought about Tommy, about my sister Emma, who probably thought I was already dead, about my mother who had given up on me long ago. I convinced myself that my death would be a gift to everyone who had ever cared about me, relieving them of the burden of hoping I would change. My first attempt didn't work the way I planned. I woke up hours later, disappointed and sick, my body fighting off the drugs, while my mind screamed in frustration. I prepared to try again, increasing the amount. This time, I felt my consciousness slipping away, like water through my fingers, and I thought I had finally found the peace I was looking for. But God wasn't ready to let me go yet. I woke up to the sound of footsteps and voices. Paramedics, who had been called by someone who had seen me through the broken church doors. "We've got a pulse, but barely," one of them said. "This is his 4th close call this month. Same kid, same location. He keeps coming back to this church." As they loaded me into the ambulance, I heard one of the EMTs, a woman with kind eyes and tired hands, say to her partner, "There's got to be a reason he keeps ending up here. Maybe God's not done with him yet." I wanted to laugh at the stupidity of that statement, but I didn't have enough strength left to make a sound. In the hospital, a social worker named Janet Rodriguez sat beside my bed with a determination that annoyed me. "Marcus," she said, reading from my file, "you're 17 years old, and you've nearly died 4 times in the past 3 weeks. At some point, you're going to succeed in harming yourself, and I can't let that happen without offering you another choice." I turned away from her, focusing on the IV drip that was probably the cleanest thing that had entered my bloodstream in years. "There is no other choice," I whispered. "This is who I am. This is all I know. Just let me go back to the church and give up." Janet leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "What if I told you there was a place where people like you, people who have lost everything, people who have given up hope, what if I told you there was a place where they learn to live again, not just survive, but actually live with purpose and hope, and something worth waking up for?" I looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. Hope was a word I had deleted from my vocabulary years ago. Purpose was something other people had, people who hadn't sold their souls for temporary numbness. "You're talking about rehab," I said. "I've been to rehab. I've been to detox. They give you pamphlets and meetings and send you back to the same life with the same problems and expect different results. "This is different," Janet said, pulling out a brochure that looked worn from being handled by desperate hands. "It's called New Life Recovery Ranch, and it's in rural Tennessee. It's a Christian program. But before you roll your eyes, understand that these people don't just preach at you, they live with you, work with you, and walk beside you through the process of rebuilding your life from the ground up." I stared at the brochure, seeing photos of people who looked like they had once been broken but now had something in their eyes that I couldn't identify. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing. It was peace. These people, who claimed to be former addicts like me, looked peaceful. Why would they want to help someone like me? I asked, my voice barely audible. Janet smiled and said, "Because someone like you helped them first." That night, for the first time in years, I fell asleep without wanting to harm myself. New Life Recovery Ranch sat on 200 acres of rolling Tennessee hills, surrounded by forests that had never heard the sound of gunshots or sirens, where the air smelled like pine trees instead of urban decay and despair. As the van from the hospital pulled up the gravel driveway, I pressed my face against the window and wondered if I had died after all, and this was some kind of purgatory designed to look like hope. The director, Pastor Michael Washington, was a mountain of a man with hands that looked like they could crush rocks, but eyes that radiated the kind of gentleness I hadn't experienced since childhood. When he helped me out of the van, supporting my weight because I was too weak to stand on my own, he said, "Welcome home, son. We've been praying for you." I wanted to tell him that prayer didn't work, that God had given up on me years ago, but I didn't have the energy to argue. My roommate was a guy named David Chen, a former meth addict from California who had lost his medical practice, his family, and his will to live before finding his way to the ranch 6 months earlier. David helped me unpack my single garbage bag of possessions, and as he folded my few remaining clothes into the wooden dresser, he said, "I know you don't believe this yet, but your life is about to change in ways you can't imagine." The first week was physical hell. Getting clean from heroin without medication was like having my entire body rebel against me while my mind played tricks on me. I was sick constantly. I shook so violently that I couldn't hold a cup of water, and I had vivid nightmares about conversations with people who had died years ago. Through it all, the staff at the ranch never left me alone. Pastor Michael sat with me during the worst nights, when I was convinced that giving up would be easier than living through another minute of withdrawal. He didn't preach at me or quote Bible verses. He just told me stories about his own addiction to alcohol that had cost him, his first marriage, and nearly his relationship with his children. "Recovery isn't about becoming perfect," he said. "It's about becoming real." What surprised me most about the ranch wasn't the therapy sessions or the group meetings, it was the work. Every day, we were expected to contribute to the functioning of the community, feeding animals, maintaining buildings, growing vegetables, cooking meals. For someone who had spent years taking from everyone around me, the act of contributing felt foreign and uncomfortable. My job was working in the stables with a horse named Redemption, a name that made me roll my eyes every time I heard it. Redemption had been rescued from a neglectful owner and was initially aggressive and distrustful of humans. As I spent hours brushing his coat and cleaning his stall, I began to see parallels between his story and mine that were impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came 6 weeks into my stay, during a therapy session with Dr. Sarah Coleman, the ranch's psychologist. She asked me to write a letter to my 13-year-old self, the boy who had first picked up that needle in the abandoned house in Flint. As I wrote, describing the pain that had led to that moment, I began to cry for the first time since Tommy's death. That little boy didn't deserve what happened to him, Dr. Coleman said as I read the letter aloud through my tears. He deserved protection, love, and safety. The drugs weren't the problem, they were his solution to unbearable pain. But now you're strong enough to find better solutions. For the first time in my life, I felt compassion for myself instead of hatred. The spiritual component of the program was the hardest for me to accept. I had cursed God for my childhood, blamed him for my addiction, and challenged him to prove his existence by letting me die. But slowly, through daily chapel services, Bible studies, and conversations with other residents who had found faith in their darkest moments, I began to consider the possibility that God hadn't abandoned me, I had abandoned him. 8 months into the program, I experienced what I can only describe as a spiritual awakening. During a prayer meeting where residents shared their testimonies, I felt something I had never felt before. Forgiveness. Not from God, I still wasn't sure about that, but from myself. I forgave the scared little boy who had turned to drugs to escape pain. I forgave the teenager who had made terrible choices to survive. And I asked God, if He was listening, to forgive me too. The day I graduated from the program, Pastor Michael pulled me aside and said something that changed the trajectory of my entire life. Marcus, you have a choice now. You can go back to your old life and try to manage your recovery alone. Or you can stay here and help us save other people who are exactly where you were 18 months ago. What do you think God is calling you to do? As I looked around at the new residents who reminded me so much of myself when I first arrived, broken and hopeless and desperate for a reason to keep breathing, I knew my answer. I spent the next 3 years at New Life Recovery Ranch, transitioning from resident to staff member to eventually becoming the program director under Pastor Michael's mentorship. During that time, I watched hundreds of broken people walk through our doors, and I learned that my story wasn't unique. Trauma, neglect, and addiction were epidemics that destroyed lives across every demographic, every socioeconomic level, every race and religion. Working with new residents forced me to relive my own journey repeatedly, but instead of triggering my desire to use, it strengthened my resolve to never go back to that life. When I looked into the eyes of a 17-year-old girl who reminded me of my sister Emma, or held the hand of a man dying from his addiction who reminded me of Tommy, I saw my purpose crystallizing into something larger than my own recovery. My relationship with God evolved slowly, like learning to trust someone who had been absent during the worst moments of your life, but claimed to have been present all along. Through intensive Bible study, prayer, and countless conversations with Pastor Michael, I began to understand that faith wasn't about having all the answers, it was about trusting God with all the questions. The call to missions came during a visit from Dr. James Mutwe, a Ugandan physician who ran medical clinics in rural villages where addiction was becoming a growing problem due to economic desperation and lack of mental health resources. As he described the faces of young people who reminded him of American addicts, I felt a familiar stirring in my spirit that I now recognized as God's voice. These young people need to hear from someone who has walked their path, Dr. McQuire said during his presentation to our staff. They need to see living proof that recovery is possible, that their lives have value, that God can use their broken pieces for something beautiful. When he made eye contact with me across the room, I knew he wasn't speaking to the group, he was speaking directly to me. The decision to leave the ranch and move to Uganda was the most difficult choice I had ever made. The ranch had become my sanctuary, my family, my safe place in a world that had shown me mostly danger. Pastor Michael walked with me through months of prayer and preparation, helping me understand that sometimes God calls us out of our comfort zones to reach people who can't be reached any other way. My family's reaction was mixed. My mother, now clean herself after her own journey through recovery, was proud but terrified. I just got my son back. She cried when I told her about my plans. Now you're going to the other side of the world. My sister Emma, now married with children of her own, said, if this is what God is calling you to do, then we support you, but promise me you'll come back safely. The fundraising process taught me humility in ways that recovery never could. Standing in front of church congregations, sharing my testimony with people who had never experienced addiction, asking for financial support for a mission they might not understand. It required a vulnerability that pushed me far outside my comfort zone. But every time I shared my story, I met someone who needed to hear it. One particularly powerful moment came when I spoke at a suburban megachurch in Nashville. After my presentation, a well-dressed businessman approached me with tears in his eyes. My son is 17, he said, and he's exactly where you were at that age. I've tried everything, therapy, rehab, tough love, enabling, and nothing works. Hearing your story gives me hope that maybe it's not too late. He handed me a check that covered half my mission expenses. The training for international missions was intense, cultural sensitivity courses, language study, though English was widely spoken in the regions where I would work, medical training for basic healthcare needs, and intensive biblical education that would allow me to serve as both counselor and pastor in communities that had limited access to either. 3 weeks before my departure, I received an unexpected visitor at the ranch. Janet Rodriguez, the social worker who had first told me about New Life Recovery Ranch, now gray-haired and approaching retirement, came to see me off. Do you remember what I told you in that hospital room? She asked. That there was a place where you could learn to live with purpose and hope. I nodded. Well, now you're going to be that place for other people. The night before I left for Uganda, I walked by the abandoned church in Memphis, where I had once planned to end my life. A plan I'm grateful God prevented. Someone had boarded up the windows and doors, but I could still see through the cracks into the sanctuary, where I had once lost all hope. Standing there, healthy and whole and filled with purpose, I said a prayer of gratitude for the God who had refused to give up on me when I had given up on myself. Tomorrow, I would board a plane to begin the greatest adventure of my life, carrying my testimony like a torch into the darkness where other people were still trying to find their way out of their own abandoned places. As I sit here in my small apartment in Kampala, Uganda, writing this testimony by candlelight, while the sounds of evening prayers echo from the mosque down the street and the church bells ring from the cathedral across town, I'm overwhelmed by the journey that brought me to this moment. Tomorrow morning, I'll drive 3 hours into the rural villages where I've been working for the past 2 years, and I'll sit with young people whose eyes hold the same desperation I once carried. The work isn't easy. Recovery never is. Whether you're in Tennessee or Uganda, I've held the hands of people as they struggled with addiction. I've watched families torn apart by substances that mirror my own childhood trauma. I've questioned God's plan on nights when the challenges felt overwhelming. But I've also witnessed miracles, former addicts becoming community leaders, broken families restored, young people discovering their worth and purpose. Every success reminds me why God saved my life in that abandoned church. If you're watching this and you're struggling with addiction, neglect, depression, or hopelessness, please hear me. Your story isn't over. The same God who met me in my darkest moment is waiting to meet you in yours. Recovery is possible. Redemption is real. And sometimes, the very experiences that nearly destroy us become the foundation for the most meaningful life we could ever imagine. Your broken pieces aren't trash. They're building materials for something beautiful. Notice. This testimony discusses addiction, family trauma, and past suicidal thoughts in the context of recovery and hope. If you're struggling with similar issues, please reach out for help. You are not alone, and your life has value.